So in this project, we did actually study digital inclusion and the notion of digital good in relation to vulnerable and different vulnerable communities, including disabled people, people with disabilities, older people, and migrants, or people with like second generation migrants, and anyway, people who had some ethnic minority background from either side of the family. So, yeah, so if it can be, yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. So, in today's talk, I will focus on just the people who participated in the study and were migrants or had ethnic minority background. And with those people, as well as with all other communities we involve in the research, we'll look into digital inclusion, exclusion, but especially in the perceptions and experiences of digital good. So because we know that there is a lot of work, research around inclusion, exclusion, but at least in the UK, there is some upcoming emerging research around the notion of digital good, which is very important and crucial for us. So we wanted to tackle this notion, what vulnerable people mean, what they think, and how they experience digital good in relation to their vulnerabilities as well, because we wanted to see what those people's narratives were around good and why is it good for them or not to make use of the digital, to be digitally included. Because we tend nowadays to take it for granted that it's good to be digitally included. So we wanted not to question that, but we really wanted to explore that with the people, with the communities involved in the study. So we thought that that's a really important issue to tackle, obviously because digital systems nowadays are so necessary, more or less, in order people, including vulnerable communities, to access and make use of rights, benefits, services, and to develop more broadly a sense of belonging. Especially, we thought that when it comes to migrant and ethnic minorities, these people, it doesn't mean that that's really the only vulnerability or the only factor we need to consider. Very often, their identities and how they perceive themselves involves other vulnerabilities. For instance, we know, and there is some research that looks at migrants who are people of older age. So how age might affect their positioning in the social and digital domain with respect to how they feel, what their experiences are, how included or excluded they are. But also in our participants, we had migrants who were, not just older people, but also had some disabilities. So sometimes disabilities, aging, and migration or ethnic identity all come together as intersecting and multi-layer vulnerabilities that we need to look together. And of course, in our research, we wanted to track down those people's experiences as well as perceptions and to come up not only with hardcore evidence about usage, whether they use, how they use, patterns of use, but also their emotions in relation to their vulnerabilities, to their environment, to the context of their living, but also to broader structural and systemic factors and related barriers. And finally, to pursue this research, we adopted a social lab approach, which we thought that really was helpful in order to bring up to the surface all these different factors and parameters of those people's experiences. And that's is gonna be something I will present briefly in the next few minutes. What was that approach? What was that social lab approach? And how we designed this research around the notion of a social lab. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the methodology, then we devise a social lab framework. Then we operationalize that framework in order to create a social lab space that was a physical space, an actual space, because all the research we did was face-to-face research, but also was a metaphorical space in which we held activities, creative activities informed by participatory research, with all the participants, and which activities were theoretically and epistemologically driven by the framework we devised, used, and operationalized. Our participants were members of an organization called Age UK organization. That's a UK, a national organization in this country, in the UK, that supports, trains, and offers networking and other opportunities to aged people, to older people, people aged over 65 years commonly. But with this organization, we decided that for the purpose of the study, our participants should be not just older people, but people who had some ethnic minority background and could relate to the experience of being a migrant, and also people that could identify themselves as disabled, so had one or more disabilities. Not all of them met all three criteria, but at least the minimum let's say, threshold for participants we set was them to identify with two of these areas of vulnerability. And therefore, we brought together all these people as one big group, a large group of participants. And we work with them then in smaller groups, with different groups engaging in different activities in the same big space, the social lab space. The activities then in that space were informed by participatory action research and were mostly creative activities. Because I don't have that much time to explain the methodology and the activities in a lot of detail, I will just say that for the sake of the questions we had in relation to the role of migration and migrant status, we mostly work with the participants with user scenarios. So what we did was mostly to provide them with scenarios, hypothetical scenarios of migrant users of the digital, and present to them different situations and circumstances those hypothetical users were experiencing, and inviting them in creative means through drawing, sketching, using laptops, gadgets, technologies, but also creating objects. So we had for them various stationery, various stickers, clay materials, things that will allow them to express themselves in a really free spirit and creative way, to report individually, but also discuss in smaller groups both how they visualize those hypothetical users, the users in the scenarios provided, and what they thought those users were feeling, experiencing, and acting upon, but also then to place themselves in the position of those hypothetical users and report on what they would do if they were in the place of those users. So we try to apply some more simulation-based practice that will allow the participants to talk not just on behalf of those hypothetical users, but also for themselves if they were in a similar position. So these were the kind of activities we engaged to answer questions around the role of migration in experiences of digital good and needed interventions and resources. Next slide. Thank you. So a few words about the framework we devised and used. It looks a little bit complicated, and it was complicated. It took us, when it came to journal articles, it took us a lot of time to find ways to simplify the framework and explain it to reviewers in a way that will be digestible, let me say. But hopefully this graph somehow schematically shows the main elements of the framework. The framework had a set of theoretical foundations, which were informed by two theories: intersectionality theory, That's why I referred earlier to intersecting vulnerability. So we didn't want to limit the research to one characteristic or one area of vulnerability. Also Foucault's social critical theory, and more specifically Foucault's concepts of power, knowledge, discipline, surveillance, resistance, and governmentality and biopower. Obviously, all of us have come across Foucault's theory. We know it's complicated, but what we tried to do as part of the framework and the theoretical foundations of the framework was to bring Foucault's these four concepts in Foucault's theory together with the intersectionality theory and adapt this combined theoretical approach to the study of digital inclusion among vulnerable people. So we explain in the papers we've written around the framework how we've done this, because although the two theories seem to appear in very different literature, nevertheless, we found a lot in common, and we thought that actually these two theories can complement one another in terms of how they can conceptually and theoretically inform the research on vulnerable people's positioning in the digital domain. Then, obviously, we thought that this theory should be translated into actual epistemology and methodology. So we thought that since the theory itself suggests that we need to look into power, discipline, surveillance, resistance, we need to bring together to the field both stakeholders, experts, and vulnerable communities, because usually the research tends to approach decision-makers, stakeholders, those who somehow have more power than vulnerable communities, separately from communities themselves. That was something that in the framework we challenged, and we said that actually to be able to engage in viable, sustainable solutions that will suit vulnerable communities towards more and better digital inclusion, we need stakeholders also to be involved throughout. So methodologically then, we design, as part of the framework, a three-stage progress work. So the work with communities and stakeholders takes place in three different stages with different activities that, as I said, are informed by participatory action research, but also the aim to put in place for decolonizing practices that enable researchers, us who do the research with stakeholders and communities, to produce decolonized knowledge. And all this in the framework, we explain that actually can help researchers answer questions around inclusion barriers, benefits, digital good or non-good, tensions and conflicting experiences among not just different vulnerable communities and groupings, but also within the same community or within the same group. So how then we apply this framework in the study? Next slide, Denise. So that framework, which suggests a broad framework for all kinds of digital inclusion research, had to be narrowed down and operationalized in a way that would make sense to the purpose of our study. So since our study wanted to make sense of the digital good, the concept of the digital good among different areas of vulnerability, we thought that we should actually look at a series of case studies. So in this study, we chose 4 case studies. One is a case study of how vulnerable people access and use social welfare services. The second is about their access and use of educational services online. The third case study was about the use of health services and information online. And the fourth case study was about the use of the digital for cultural, community, and broader networking activities and to access similar resources. So we look at those 4 case studies, taking into consideration that there are 4 levels of digital inclusion. And those of us who are familiar with digital inclusion literature, we know that usually there are 3 levels the suggestions that there are 3 levels of digital inclusion, but in our case, we took a different approach to digital inclusion. We divided digital inclusion into 4 levels. The first level, the bottom level, is that of individual empowerment. The second is that of interpersonal exchange. The third of community involvement, and the fourth of societal participation. And we think that there is an upward trend in order to vulnerable communities to be able to participate in the society through the digital. So level 4, the first need to have achieved, to have tick levels 1, 2, 3. So you can't go all the way up without having achieved inclusion at the more bottom or low levels. So as I said, in the framework, we wanted to involve both vulnerable communities and stakeholders. And the data collection involved participatory methods and focus groups. Epistemologically, we employed decolonizing practices and principles in order to achieve mutual learning, not only among participants, but also between researchers and participants. And obviously, we were accepting all the knowledge and insights that was coming from the participants. So we adopted the position of a bottom-up knowledge generation. And obviously, throughout the research process, at the bottom, you see that we everything we did in the social lab was determined by the aims of this of our study, the questions, and EDI principles that suggest the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion within the research process. Next slide, please. Right. So as part then of the activities with those participants who had a migrant or ethnic minority background, we used a few different scenarios, but 2 were the anchoring scenarios, the user scenarios we used in order to enable them to work together in small groups as well as individually if they wanted to, and come up with graphical, verbal, textual, or even objects as outputs and insights. So the first scenario was referring to a hypothetical user named Ali. And the core idea in that scenario was that actually, yes, on social media platforms such as Facebook, there are still instances of online racism. Online racism is not, or discrimination online is not quite the same as offline discrimination, because obviously the means, the platforms, the tools, the ways it can be that discrimination, racism can be expressed can be different to how they are expressed offline. So all participants were provided with a description of the scenario, which was quite detailed. It was detailed in order to enable our participants, to feel how that person, the hypothetical user, could feel in that situation. But just for the sake of this talk, I just give a couple of lines, a summary of that scenario. So essentially, in that scenario, we had a young man from the Middle East who received a racist comment on Facebook, and he decided to report it. Following his reporting, that post is removed, but nothing else or more happens. That was the core idea of the scenario. Next, Denise. Thank you. So then, as I said, we enable the participants to engage in various conversations and activities around that scenario. And we came up with themes that derive directly from them, their activities and outputs. One core theme in the participants' insights was the emotions of that hypothetical user. So participants expressed a pretty rich emotional landscape, which, however, was filled up with unpleasant, rather negative emotions, such as the emotions of fear, despair, anger, sadness, confusion, and powerlessness. So it's not just one emotion, and different participants focus or stress highlighted some emotions more than others. Why? Because they, from their perspective, they emphasize, given the personality, different emotions. So we can hypothesize that, if we had multiple users, which actually happens in the position of Ali, of that hypothetical user, not all users will experience exactly the same emotions. But nevertheless, all emotions have a negative tone, have a negative character. And that's what we wanted to somehow keep in mind, that although different emotions were brought up, they were all on the negative side. Next. Alongside the emotions, our participants seem to feel that Ali, that user, should also, alongside all these emotions, have dilemmas about what to do next, how to behave, how to practically address racist comments or attacks online. And therefore, our participants say things about Ali, such as, oh, he doesn't know what to do, to question whether actually he should go to the police and take more action. They also, in the scenario, we say where he reported the incident, the participants say that it's very clear for people like Ali to know exactly what to report what, and what is the right reporting pathway for them. Also, the formulated that Ali, that user, should have been frustrated with the lack of protection from the platform itself, and the fact that the platform just removed the post but did not act further and did not keep in touch with the user. And they also brought up the practical and emotional consequence for users like Ali, which suggests isolation, that users like Ali, by avoiding perpetrators, those who might be racist online, they might feel more and more isolated. And that isolation can be compounded with the offline isolation and areas of exclusion they anyway experience offline. Next. So, the participants for this user scenario suggested that on the one hand, we have emotions, difficult emotions for users like Ali, but on the other hand, we have actual practical issues and questions around the responsibility of platform, the best ways to report, the best ways to act and protect yourself, and whether actually protection is enough, whether the psychological adverse effects on the user is something that we should also look more into. And as a particular theme in the outputs, in the participants' discourses and other outputs, we really saw that they emphasize the limited responsibility that online platforms take nowadays. For instance, they stated that a lot of the reporting tools appear to be more symbolic rather than practically meaningful and effective. They seem not to be happy with the idea that the only thing platforms tend to do is to remove reported content, and that seems to be the end of their accountability. That seems to be enough for them to portray themselves as platforms as being sufficiently accountable. They thought that there should be follow-up support to users who have been attacked in various ways, because in this case, yeah, it could be a racist comment, but there are all kinds of attacks, as we know, that verbal and other attacks that can happen online. So they emphasize the importance of follow-up and different additional support to the user. And they got some of the participants go to the point of even thinking that nowadays racist words, discourses, content, images, and all kinds of content online, they seem to be treated as content rather than as harm. So they argue that even from a regulation and the perspective of what rules and laws we have, actually such content should not be thought of as content, but as direct harm caused to any user. So there was a whole discourse around the limited responsibility and accountability of the platforms and the laws that make platforms get away with such incidents, claiming to be responsible and accountable enough. Next. Something else we look into participant outputs was the actual language. We conducted some discourse analysis of the language, and it was quite nice, I would say, to see that on the one hand, when it came to emotions, they used negative qualifiers like words like sad, frustrated, disappointed, interjections and emoticons to express emotions. So they seem to like emoticons, emojis a lot in their outputs. But at the same time, it was really nice to see that there was a collective framing around those discourses. The participants did not put forward such negative and critical discourses referring to individual responsibility, or the individual user. Rather, they use collective frames presenting Ali as hypothetical user as a victim, one of the many victims, and platforms and regulations as systems. So they did not seem to focus so much on Ali as individual user and what Ali did or did not do well enough, or the Facebook as a isolated single platform. But they actually had this more collective framing, suggesting that it's not really about the individual user, it's about all of us, it's about all potential victims, and it's about all platforms and all systems governing and regulating such platforms. And in the language, we also saw that there was in the language, in the discourses, there was a quite prominent sense of doubt and insecurity when it came to institutions and how institutions and systems protect users like Ali. So that was a prominent discourse that seemed to suggest that participants, vulnerable participants, do not really trust systems and institutions when it comes to the digital. And of course, we might hypothesize that that's not because of the digital, but that's a prominent lack of trust and doubt about how vulnerable people, are protected from systems. Next. The second scenario that we also presented to the participants, and we got very rich insights from our participants about that, was a scenario about a hypothetical user called Fatima, female user this time, who in the scenario was an asylum seeker navigating digital welfare systems. So as an asylum seeker, she was very new in the UK, and had to understand what her rights were, how she could look for health services, social services, what benefits she could have, how she could manage her everyday living and the welfare system in this new country. So a summary of the scenario states that a newly arrived asylum seeker must apply for benefits online, limited English language skills, and limited also digital skills make the process confusing and stressful for Fatima. That was the core idea of the scenario. Yeah, so we have not just an asylum seeker who does not know the system, but also does not speak English that much, and her digital skills are also quite limited. So we invited the participants to reflect on this scenario as well. Next. So our participants joined themselves into that scenario. They acknowledge that language is a barrier for those who come to any country and did not speak the language. So they thought that, yes, to navigate the online realm where English language dominates, not just because we're in England, in the UK, but also dominates internationally, it can be a serious barrier. Also, they acknowledge the barrier of digital literacy, the fact that Fatima did not know much about the digital. And they also interestingly stated that people like Fatima probably need to rely on caseworkers. They need to find a caseworker to go to a migration center or center in a local council office, find the person, find the right caseworker, and rest on the willingness, help, and personality and character of that caseworker, which is a stranger to them. And that can be quite stressful. Also, because there are asylum, Fatima was an asylum seeker. Obviously, it was in a transition phase, so they thought that she should be overwhelmed by feelings of fear and anxiety about possible loss of support, not getting asylum in the end, and how to navigate completely new systems in a completely new country all by herself. Next. Again, here, emotions seem to prevail in participant discourses. So the emotions they brought up were those of confusion, worry, stress, fear of making mistakes, fear of losing benefits and entitlements. Next. They stated that, unfortunately, for Fatima and similar people, the system does not provide tools, online tools on welfare benefits and other entitlements that are designed for newcomers and those who might not speak the language. The language support offered to those people is inconsistent. Also, staff caseworkers' friendliness and attitude can vary, and there's no way to control or know in advance. And accessibility, really, to how Fatima and similar people will access benefits and similar welfare resources in a new country, really is relying on individual, those who are on the system, their goodwill and their willingness really to help and assist. Next. So for Fatima and people like Fatima, the participants stress the importance of support. So they stress then, therefore, that because there are all these barriers, it's very important that people like Fatima are offered translation services, English classes, obviously for free, digital skills training for free, and job center support. These were the areas of support they thought that people like Fatima should really receive in order to be able to access digital resources of that kind. Next. So on the whole, they recognize the emotional toll of digital exclusion for people like Fatima, and especially the bottom emotion, the feeling of locked out, of being locked out, left out of essential services, knowing that there are things there for you, but you don't know where they are and how to access them. Next. And across the two scenarios, we had commonly appeared themes. The themes of emotional vulnerability, systemic inadequacy, unclear pathways to help and support, dependence on intermediaries like caseworkers, and mistrust or even distrust to the systems, to the digital systems. And these scenarios, the stories of Ali and Fatima, are not exceptional stories. That's something the participants recognize, and themselves as migrants themselves, or even people, second generation migrants with ethnic minority backgrounds, they could remember also other people from the family having similar emotions, stories, and problems. So they argued that these are not exceptional cases, are everyday realities that reveal systemic problems and patterns and call for systemic change. They kept referring to systems and the importance of systemic change. Next. So our participants then, reflecting also on themselves, not just on Fatima, on the scenarios of Fatima and Ali, say that racism online is often normalized. It's often something that is okay. Yeah, these things happen. Nobody seems to be bothered really too much. They say that they know from personal experience, an experience of the people in the same family and community, that the welfare systems assume fluency, language fluency, and that's a problem. And that obviously the online reporting mechanisms, when there is a problem, they are not really very effective. They lack teeth, as they say. And eventually they stress that vulnerability, being vulnerable, is not to do with it's not an individual problem. It's not to do with them as individuals. It's to do with how they are positioned in a broader system, in a broader context. So it is relational. Next. So through this social lab approach, then we managed to diagnose, to identify lots of very interesting, rich findings. Next. We managed to bring to the surface emotional realities for migrants and ethnic minorities, to reveal systemic blind spots where systems lack attention and action. We saw that people use a lot of collective language and framing. So it was very nice to see that actually the participants seem to think that these are collective problems that should not be addressed by individuals alone. And through this framework, we manage actually to think of how the individual experience can be linked to policy change, systemic change, and new ideas about policy making. Next. And that's the last thing, because I think we need to move on to questions. So therefore, the participants say that the systems currently do not work. Resources are not really there for migrants and ethnic minorities, but they are needed. And the resources they identify as really needed are resources coming from formal institutions such as police, the platforms themselves like Facebook, job centers, but also the stress importance of informal networks, the importance of support from the community groups, friends, family, if available. And of course, they supported self-advocacy tools such as seeking advice, reporting, blogging, taking action that the system enables and allows. And I think I should stop here so that we have more time for questions. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this, Panayiota. This was so extremely interesting, and I can speak at least for myself. I think it's also very recognizable, these kinds of stories and the findings you have, but to propose it within such a novel framework, within this social lab framework, is really interesting, and I think indeed crucial for both the research that we are doing, but also for policy. So I know that questions for you on that, but I want to give the floor to other people first.
Thank you.
The microphone. So if there's anyone that would like to ask a question to Panayiota, we have a couple of minutes left. So Chidem.
I can start, and maybe if we can enable the chat, people can also put their questions in the chat, or feel free to turn on your microphone and raise a hand. Panayiota, thank you so much for this really insightful talk. I have actually many questions in my mind, but I will start with one related to the methodological approach, because I really appreciate this more bottom-up approach and creating knowledge together. And I really liked how you framed it, collective sense making, not even just the researchers. You also invited policymakers and other people who are involved in these decision-making processes. So it's really valuable. So my question goes in this direction in terms of how you did it in practice. I'm very curious to hear about that, because you mentioned that social lab approach is also seen as a physical space, for example. How did you organize it in terms of how often you met, how did you invite people, how did you approach people, were people able to come there? Can you maybe tell us a little bit of the background story of how you practically did it?
Yes, thank you, Signam. The truth is that it will not be possible to do this study without the assistance of HUK, the organization, and I do really think that this kind of research requires the collaboration of community or third sector actors and bodies that are in direct connection with communities, and communities trust them. So to have access to those communities, you need to build a relationship of trust, but also you need some resources. And usually such organizations have resources. In other words, have a venue, have admin support, know the members, know the people really well, so they can actually inform you of accessibility related concerns, because sometimes people, if they don't know you, they might not reveal all their needs. So it was quite important for us to know that we could work together with HUK in order to approach the people, but also to understand the needs, to understand what will be the right venue, the right context to develop this social lab space. So we started building all these work together with the organization. So the organization then provided the space that was the right space for the study. The social labs study was not just one-off thing, because again, the idea of bringing together lots of people who were really strangers to one another suggests that they need time, and therefore we build the activities in a way that will enable them to develop rapport and feel more comfortable with each other over time. So what we did was to organize like a 3-day long lab. So we, from the beginning, we explained to all participants that we would like to be with them for 3 full days. And therefore, obviously, the transport, other costs, catering, food were all provided. But if, for whatever reason, somebody could not stay for the full day, had to go halfway through, unfortunately, we had to say no to them, because it was very important that they had enough time to feel members of that space, members of the group, and to start developing through a scaffolding approach a better sense of why we're doing those activities and why those were relevant to their own individual stories. So we stay with all participants for 3 days, not overnight, from morning until late afternoon. So we had lunch together, we had food together. As I said, we were providing to them gadgets, objects, things. So they were doing things together. They were experimenting with making little things, sketching, drawing, and it was a very, I think they did enjoy it, because the idea was that we were addressing difficult and serious issues, but in a fairly fun way. Because especially when you invite people to stay with you for so many hours, you need to ensure that that's really engaging. If I were to redo this study, I think I would have done some pilot research first with a much smaller group of people. Of course, at the end of the study, we ask participants to provide feedback, but again in a fun way. So we knew what they liked and what they didn't like, but I wish we knew some of those things before the end of the study. So I will definitely recommend pilot study, because depending on the communities you get involved in the study, depending the area, the region they come from, the rapport they develop with them, you might need to change certain things. The length of certain activities, the way you communicate the activities, how structural or structural activity is. I think a lot of testing is needed so that you really think that they enjoyed everything a lot. In our case, we think they enjoyed most, but there were a couple of things that confused them, for instance. And we didn't know that they confused them. We found out only at the end when we received the feedback. So yeah, I think especially when you try out something new, it's very important to pilot it first.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you so much. We do have one more question in the chat. Would you have time for that?
Yes,
and then we finish up. So this question was posed by Mal. She says, first of all, she thanks you. I think you can read it in the chat as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mal.
But she was wondering how you approach disability in your work. Do you understand them as relational, i.e. people are made disabled by the systems they inhabit? And do you make a distinction between different types of or kinds of disabilities in your approach?
Oh, sorry, I muted myself. Yes, sorry, my mistake. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Maud, for this question. Actually, we and that's something I take, I adopt in my research. Although I appreciate the social model of disability, which suggests that it's socially constructed disability, nevertheless, I'm more in favor of the biopsychosocial model, which brings together the biological, the psychological, and the societal parameters that all together build both the self-perception of disability, how people perceive themselves as disabled people, but also their social positioning. In this study, because we did not only have disabled participants, we kept open the scope of disability. So we had a range of disabilities involved, physical disabilities like mobility impairment, vision impairment, like we had one participant who was blind, also disabilities concerning long-term illness or long-term fatigue, difficulty in engaging group work, neurodiverse participants. And obviously, because we knew about these disabilities beforehand, we were able to ensure, for instance, the participants who were neurodiverse will work with a smaller group of people. Or if they wanted to work just in pairs, they could work in pairs. So it is very important for the actual research to make sure that you do know the disabilities, but we did not have any kind of constraint or any limitation with respect to which disabilities we could engage in the study, because the study itself wanted to make sense of, first of all, how people perceive themselves and their digital experiences and the digital good in relation to one or multiple vulnerabilities. So it was done for them to say and understand whether actually disability is something that is important to them to raise as the focal point in their engagement. I hope this answers your question.
Maud, do you know? Do you want to turn on your mic? Maybe not.
Maud tells me her mic is not working, but she's coming to me.
Did it answer her question?
Hi, sorry, my mic and my camera don't work, but thank you for the elaborate explanation. And I wasn't aware of this model, but thank you for raising it, because I think it's very appropriate to use. So thank you, and thanks for all the wonderful work that you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much for coming all the way to be heard. Yeah, that's a very interesting model, and actually it's a model that I use in my published work. It's something that I discuss and explain in some of my work, why I go for this model and not for the social model, for instance. Yeah.